Hello, family. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The morning was heavy with humidity as Faith Adams approached the gleaming glass doors of Blake Holdings. She tightened her grip on the brown envelope containing her resume, her fingers trembling slightly. Dressed in a simple blue gown with faded seams and well-worn sandals, she stood out, and not in the way the other applicants would have preferred. The receptionist barely glanced at her before pointing her to the waiting room. Inside, rows of sharply dressed candidates whispered among themselves, their polished shoes tapping against the pristine tiled floor. A few eyes flicked to Faith's feet, lingering with amusement and disdain. One woman with sleek braids leaned over and whispered, "Who still wears rubber sandals to a corporate interview?" Her companion chuckled, their laughter soft but sharp. Faith sat near the window, head bowed, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. She wasn't ashamed, just cautious. She knew the world didn't often wait for stories behind scuffed shoes. As she waited, she studied the company's brochure, deliberately ignoring the rising tension around her. The building buzzed with professionalism, bright lights, murmured phone calls, and the scent of cologne that clung heavily in the air. Everyone seemed to be performing. Postures perfect, smiles manufactured. She glanced at her reflection in the glass wall beside her, her dark skin glowing slightly under the morning light, eyes clear despite the shadows beneath them. She had not come to impress with style. She came to stand for something far deeper. Yet the weight of her modest attire pressed against her confidence. Just as she looked back down, James Whitmore, the chairman's PA, strutted into the room. His suit was sharp, and his eyes scanned the group like a judge at a fashion show. When his eyes landed on Faith, he stopped. A subtle sneer forming on his lips told her everything. He didn't need to ask her name. He had already decided she wasn't worth knowing. But Faith only inhaled slowly, closed her file, and sat straighter. She didn't come this far to shrink under scrutiny. Not today. James paused at the entrance of the room like a man stepping onto a stage. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he scanned the candidates like merchandise on a shelf. His gaze locked on Faith. His brow lifted slightly, almost amused. "Excuse me," he said, lips curving into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Miss, are you here for the interview, or did you get lost on your way to the market?" A few stifled laughs rippled through the room. Faith looked up slowly, but said nothing, gripping her envelope a little tighter. "We have a certain standard here at Blake Holdings," James continued, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your shoes alone are enough reason to reconsider." The room went quiet. Lily, who had just entered with a clipboard, froze by the wall. Her eyes darted to James, then to Faith, then back down to her notes, saying nothing. Faith's cheeks grew warm, but her voice remained level. "I'm here for the 11:30 marketing assistant slot. I believe I meet all the written qualifications." James gave a smug laugh, shaking his head. "Sweetheart, qualifications mean nothing if you don't look the part. This company entertains clients from Geneva, not pity parties from the streets." His words sliced through the air, and Faith felt a sharp sting deep in her chest. But still, she didn't budge. She slowly rose to her feet, brushed the folds of her dress flat, and looked James in the eye. "I may not wear designer shoes," she said calmly, "but I came prepared, Mr. James Whitmore, Executive Secretary to the Chairman," he replied, his tone laced with pride. "And as such, I'm letting you know you won't be called in. You may leave before you embarrass yourself further." A heavy silence followed his words. Lily opened her mouth, but then looked away, jaw tense. Faith nodded once. "Understood," she said softly. But just before turning, she looked around the room, at the faces smirking, eyes averted, and allowed herself a moment of quiet grace. She did not cry, not here, not for them. Faith stepped out into the hallway, her fingers still tightly gripping the envelope that now felt heavier than it had that morning. The voices inside the waiting room became muffled as the door closed behind her. Her steps echoed on the marble floor, a contrast to the silence within. Lily stood by the water dispenser, watching her leave. The HR officer looked conflicted, her knuckles white as she gripped her clipboard. Her eyes followed Faith's figure, composed but clearly wounded, and something inside her ached. She had seen discrimination before, but this was different. There had been a steadiness in Faith's silence, something that made Lily's own cowardice feel loud. She thought of calling after her, but didn't. The weight of corporate conformity pinned her feet in place. Inside the waiting room, Agnes sat near the back, her pen stilling over the notes she had been reviewing. Her gaze lingered on James, who had returned to his phone with the smugness of a man who believed he'd done his job. Agnes had worked under the chairman for nearly 10 years. She had seen arrogance come and go, but James's brand of cruelty felt particularly sour. There was something about that girl, she thought. The calm, the dignity, the restraint. Most people would have lashed out or crumbled, but Faith had done neither. Instead, she carried her rejection as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Agnes rose quietly, stepping out into the hall just in time to see the elevator doors slide shut. "You handled that poorly," she muttered under her breath toward James as she passed. "She didn't belong here," James replied, not even looking up. Agnes didn't answer. She simply kept walking, the ghost of Faith's face imprinted on her thoughts. Some women left quietly, others left a storm in their silence. Faith stood just inside the building's front doors, her hand resting on the cool metal bar. Outside, the sun was still harsh, but it felt colder now. Her stomach knotted with the familiar ache of being dismissed, not for lack of ability, but for lack of appearance. She took a deep breath and turned back one last time. The receptionist behind the desk didn't look up. Her voice was low and steady as she approached. "Could you kindly give a message to Mr. Thompson Blake? Tell him Faith Adams came by." The moment the name left her lips, the receptionist blinked up in confusion. Her hands paused mid-type. "Pardon who?" she asked. "Faith Adams," she repeated. "He'll understand." Without waiting for more questions, Faith turned on her heels and walked out the door. Inside, the receptionist stood frozen, the name sounding oddly familiar. She reached for the phone, glancing toward the hallway nervously. The waiting room door opened again, just as Lily stepped out. Their eyes met, and the receptionist mouthed the words, "Faith Adams." Lily's heart skipped. Her mind raced to connect the name to the distant memory of a dusty company file she'd once stumbled upon in HR archives. Before she could say anything, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the marble lobby. "Who said Faith Adams?" came a commanding voice. Everyone turned. Mr. Thompson Blake, the usually distant CEO, descended the staircase with an urgency no one had ever seen. "Where is she?" he asked, eyes scanning. Lily pointed toward the entrance. The glass doors swung slightly as if Faith's presence still lingered. "Get her back, now," he ordered. The entire building felt as though it had paused, holding its breath. Behind them, James looked up from his phone, and for the first time in years, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The glass doors hadn't even stopped swinging before Mr. Thompson Blake burst through them, his breathing uneven as his eyes darted across the front steps. For a man in his 60s, his pace was astonishing. "Where did she go?" he demanded from the confused receptionist. "She just left, seconds ago," she stammered. "Why? Who is she?" But the chairman didn't respond. Instead, he turned and called to the building security officer, "Send someone to find her. Check outside. Now!" His deep baritone voice, rarely raised, caused murmurs among nearby staff. Lily's face had gone pale. She looked at Agnes, whose eyes had widened with recognition. "He knows her," Lily whispered, stunned. Upstairs, James had emerged from the elevator, eyes narrowing at the commotion. When he asked what was going on, someone replied flatly, "The chairman's looking for a girl named Faith Adams." James's blood drained from his face as the name echoed in his mind like a warning. Then it happened. Just as the security guard reached the door, Faith reappeared on her own. Her figure walked slowly back toward the entrance, unaware of the chaos she'd triggered. Mr. Blake spotted her first. "Faith," he called, voice breaking slightly. She stopped. The entire lobby watched as the chairman, a man known for his distance and pride, strode toward her with open arms. "My dear girl," he breathed, embracing her tightly. Faith stiffened at first, then allowed herself to relax. "It's been a long time, sir," she said quietly. "You've grown into your father's strength," he murmured. The hush that fell over the room was complete. Mouths hung open, phones stilled. James looked as though he'd swallowed glass. Faith turned her head slightly and caught his expression. But she didn't gloat. She simply said, "I came to be treated like everyone else." Mr. Blake's eyes narrowed at James, his disappointment evident. "Let's talk privately," he said, guiding Faith toward the elevator himself, past stunned employees who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The elevator ascended in strained silence, with Mr. Blake standing beside Faith like a protective father. "I never expected you to come through the front doors unannounced," he finally said, his voice softening. "I needed to know what this place had become," Faith replied. "And now I do." When the doors opened to the executive floor, the staff stood frozen. No one could recall the chairman ever escorting anyone personally. He waved off his assistants and motioned toward his private suite. Faith walked beside him without hesitation, while whispers began trickling through the upper floor. "Who is she?" a junior manager whispered. "Did he say Adams?" murmured another. Downstairs, Lily stared at the digital display above the elevator in disbelief. Agnes, however, leaned back in her seat with the faintest smile on her lips, as if something unspoken had finally made sense. James remained rooted in place, each step Faith had taken upstairs still replaying in his mind. He had mocked her less than an hour ago. Now the chairman had embraced her. The air around him thickened with tension. Lily finally spoke. "James, you may want to explain that outburst in writing," she said coldly. "Because the girl you insulted?" The chairman just called her "my dear girl." James scoffed, trying to appear unfazed. "So what? Maybe she's a family friend. It doesn't change company protocol." Agnes looked up then, her tone sharp and cutting. "It changes everything when you judge someone by a pair of shoes instead of their story." Upstairs, in Mr. Blake's office, Faith stood by the window, gazing down at the city. "They haven't changed, have they?" she asked. "No," Mr. Blake said quietly, "but maybe you're the one who'll remind them who we used to be." She said nothing. Her silence spoke more powerfully than protest. Back in the waiting area, the tension was still thick. Candidates whispered nervously, some asking if they should leave, unsure what just happened. James adjusted his cufflinks and made a feeble attempt to retake control. "We'll continue with the interview queue shortly," he said, but his voice lacked its usual swagger. No one responded. A senior HR manager approached him, whispering sternly, "You've been summoned to the boardroom." "Now." He nodded stiffly, throat tightening. Upstairs, Faith was offered tea in a china cup embossed with the company's crest. She held it with both hands, still processing everything. Mr. Blake sat across from her, no longer a chairman, just an old man staring at the daughter of someone he once called a brother. As James entered the boardroom, he was met with Mr. Blake's glare and an uncomfortable silence. "Do you know who that young woman is?" Mr. Blake asked. "She's Faith Adams, daughter of the late John Adams, my partner. The man who saved this company from financial ruin 15 years ago while you were still printing resumes." James's jaw clenched. "Sir, I didn't know. You didn't care to know," Mr. Blake snapped. "You judged a book by its cover and slammed it shut before reading the first page." James swallowed hard, but said nothing more. Back downstairs, the candidates were informed the session was being rescheduled. Agnes passed by Lily and quietly murmured, "The room changed the moment she walked in. They just didn't realize it." Faith remained on the top floor for now, sipping tea with steady hands. She hadn't come to cause chaos, but truth had its own way of rewriting rooms. Faith sat in the warm, quietly lit lounge adjoining the chairman's office. She cupped the porcelain mug delicately, the scent of chamomile calming her nerves. Mr. Blake reclined across from her in a deep leather chair, his expression pained yet tender. "You've grown into your father's resilience," he murmured. "But I wish you hadn't had to prove it like this." Faith glanced down at her lap, the rim of her skirt damp from the drizzle outside. "I wasn't looking for special treatment," she said gently. "I came to see the truth for myself. My father told me what this company once stood for, but he also told me what it had become." Mr. Blake sighed deeply. "I've tried to preserve that legacy, but the rot has a way of hiding until it reaches the surface." The only sounds in the room were the soft ticking of the antique wall clock and the distant hum of elevators outside the door. "You should have told me you were coming," he said again, quieter this time. Faith met his eyes. "If I had, would I have seen the way I was treated? Would James have been exposed? Would the whispers have surfaced?" Mr. Blake leaned forward, pressing his fingers together. "You're right, and I'm ashamed you had to walk through the front door as a stranger." She nodded once, but I needed to. A long silence passed between them. Finally, he said, "You're still welcome here in any capacity you choose. You'll be offered a role appropriate to your skill, not your surname." Faith's gaze dropped to the rug beneath her feet. "Then let me earn it," she replied. "Start me at the level I applied for. Let me fight for the chair, not inherit it." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "You have your father's pride," he said, voice thick with emotion, "and his fire. Very well, Faith. We'll do this your way." She smiled faintly, and it was the first time that day her shoulders didn't feel heavy. That evening, Mr. Blake sat alone in his dimly lit office, the amber lights casting long shadows on the photographs lining the shelf behind his desk. His eyes rested on one in particular. Two young men in their 30s, arms slung around each other, grinning with ambition. One of them was himself. The other was John Adams, Faith's father. He picked up the frame and stared long and hard, guilt-carving new lines into his already aged face. "We built this together," he whispered. "And I let your daughter walk through our doors like a beggar." His voice cracked. He recalled their final conversation in the hospital room 10 years ago, John's eyes tired, his voice weak but determined. "Promise me," John had said, "if she ever finds her way to that company, don't shield her. Let her earn it, but never forget whose daughter she is." Thompson had promised, but over the years, distraction and politics buried the memory. The newer staff knew nothing of John's legacy, how he had saved the company with a last-minute merger, how he'd refused to take the spotlight. John had preferred silence over glory. Faith had inherited that same silent strength. Now, Mr. Blake realized how far the company had drifted from its roots. He opened his drawer and retrieved a worn envelope, addressed in John's careful handwriting. "For Faith, if ever," it read. He'd never delivered it, believing she wasn't ready, or perhaps fearing what it would stir. But she was more than ready. She had walked into a storm, endured humiliation, and still demanded no apology. She had been her father's child through and through. As Thompson stared at the letter, he murmured to the empty room, "I've failed you, John, but I will not fail her." Faith sat on the guest bed that night, her resume and a half-eaten meal untouched beside her. The events of the day weighed heavily on her, but it wasn't anger that kept her awake. It was memory. She opened the small wooden box she always carried in her suitcase, retrieving a faded photograph of her father holding her as a toddler. She remembered his voice, his stories, and most of all, his warnings. "The world will doubt your worth before it sees your value, but never doubt yourself, Faith." Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain of humiliation, but from the ache of missing him at a moment like this. If he had been here, she knew he would have chuckled softly and said, "You handled it just like I knew you would." The next morning, she returned to the office as requested, dressed just the same as before, modest, comfortable, and untouched by vanity. Mr. Blake met her in the conference room and handed her an official letter of employment. "Welcome to Blake Holdings, Marketing Associate," he said, smiling with pride. "Your father would have demanded nothing less than you earning it." Faith read the letter, then looked up with clear eyes. "Thank you for remembering him," she said. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "He wasn't just my colleague, Faith. He was my conscience, and I've ignored it for too long." In the corner of the room stood Agnes, watching silently. She had known bits of John's legacy, whispers from the past, but now she saw it walking, breathing, and standing in front of her in the form of a composed young woman. That moment marked more than just a hire. It was a restoration of a name long buried, and a reckoning that had only just begun. The atmosphere at Blake Holdings shifted overnight. By the following morning, whispers buzzed like electricity through the halls. James sat rigid behind his desk, eyes fixed on the screen but mind elsewhere. The reprimand had come first thing, formally typed, signed by Mr. Blake, and delivered by HR with no space for negotiation. The letter was brief but precise. You violated company ethics by dismissing a qualified candidate based on appearance. A second infraction will not be tolerated." James had signed it with a trembling hand, but his pride remained bruised. No apology had been enough. When Faith entered the floor that day, now officially part of the team, the entire office went still. Not because she looked different, she didn't. It was because now they all knew who she was. But Faith kept her head up, her steps steady. She walked to her desk, one of the farthest from the glass offices, and sat like any new employee would. Later that afternoon, Lily quietly approached Faith's workstation, eyes downcast. "I should have spoken up," she murmured, voice tight with guilt. "I saw what happened that day, and I froze." Faith glanced at her, then offered a faint nod. "It's not easy to speak up against the current," she said softly, "but I appreciate you coming now." Lily looked relieved, though the weight of her silence still hung in the air. Then, as Faith was reviewing her onboarding documents, Agnes walked by, no words, no exaggerated greeting, just a gentle pat on Faith's shoulder and the quiet comment, "People will stare. Let them. Just keep walking." It was the first time someone in the office acknowledged her not as a mystery or legacy, but as a person. Faith exhaled slowly, returning to her work, deciding then that she wouldn't wait for acceptance. She'd earn respect the same way her father had, by rising above the noise and letting her results speak for themselves. By the third day, Faith's name had done more traveling through the office than her resume ever could. Conversations paused when she passed. Desks went unusually quiet. She noticed the way her coworkers offered forced smiles or averted gazes altogether, uncertain whether to treat her like royalty or a threat. She made no attempt to correct them. During the lunch break, she took her food to the bench outside the building instead of joining the groups in the lounge. The breeze felt honest. It didn't care about lineage or gossip. Yet even outside, a few employees peered through the glass windows at her. Some with curiosity, others with unease. "She's the daughter of John Adams, they say," one whispered. "But she doesn't even carry a designer bag." Another replied, "Maybe that's the point. She doesn't need one to be heard." Despite the unease around her, Faith remained grounded. Her desk was tidy, her work consistent, and her tone professional. She didn't use the chairman's name to gain favor, nor did she reference her father in meetings. She introduced herself simply, "Faith Adams, marketing team." When her supervisor assigned her a smaller campaign, a client considered non-priority, she didn't flinch. Instead, she threw herself into the project, spending late evenings researching, revising, and building a brand proposal that exceeded expectations. Word began to spread. Not about her name, but about her precision, her ideas, her calm presence. But inside, Faith wrestled with the paradox. Her name had opened a door, yet she wanted to walk through it on her own 2 feet. In the stairwell one evening, she paused as she heard 2 younger staff debating. "Do you think she's pretending to be humble?" one said. "I don't know," the other replied. "But if she is, she's doing a better job at this than half of us." Faith smiled faintly and continued climbing the stairs. Let them wonder. That wasn't her burden to carry. The contrast between Faith and her surroundings grew more visible with each passing day. While others flaunted elegance with perfume-laced scarves and loud designer heels, she came in quietly, pressed blouses, soft makeup, and an old laptop bag that carried more wisdom than wealth. Though she was now recognized, it didn't come with warmth. She'd been invited to a team lunch, but arrived to find an awkwardly silent table where conversations died whenever she looked up. It stung, but she'd prepared herself for this. As she excused herself early, she crossed paths with the janitor, an older woman with a weary but kind face. "You okay, my daughter?" she asked in Igbo-accented English, offering her a sachet of water. Faith accepted it with gratitude. "Yes, ma, just needed air," she said softly. "You remind me of someone I knew," the woman said, studying her. "He used to walk like the ground didn't owe him anything. But when he spoke, people listened." Faith paused. "His name wouldn't be John Adams, would it?" The woman gasped, covering her mouth. "You're his daughter?" Faith nodded. The janitor's eyes welled with tears. "That man once gave me transport money when my son was in the hospital. He didn't let me return it. Said I should give it to someone else someday." Faith's throat tightened. He never mentioned that. The woman smiled. He wouldn't. He never liked noise. That brief moment with someone who saw her for who she was, and not what she represented, washed away the discomfort of the lunch. Faith walked back into the building, renewed, her spirit lifted by a memory of her father's goodness. She returned to her desk and resumed work. The computer didn't care about surnames. The task before her didn't require apologies. In that moment, she realized something profound. You don't have to fit in to belong. You just have to plant yourself where purpose finds root and let the rest unfold in silence. James paced his office like a man walking toward a noose. He had spent the past few days trying to reclaim control, smiling harder, dressing sharper, overcompensating in meetings, but the subtle shift in how people regarded him gnawed at his ego. He caught glimpses of hushed conversations that stopped when he entered. Eyes lingered longer, no longer in admiration, but in careful scrutiny. His pride screamed for vindication. That afternoon, he drafted a formal complaint against Faith, citing undue influence and favoritism in her onboarding. He didn't send it immediately. Instead, he carried it to Mr. Blake's office, shoulders squared like a soldier reporting for duty. But the moment the chairman glanced at the header, his expression hardened. "Is this a joke?" he asked, tossing the file aside without reading further. "You're filing a grievance against someone who asked for no privileges and earned every inch of her space?" James's jaw clenched. "Sir, I just feel—" "No," Mr. Blake interrupted, standing. "You feel threatened. And instead of reflecting on your actions, you're trying to weaponize process. That's not leadership, James. That's cowardice." James froze, unsure how to respond. "Do you know what John Adams did for this company?" the chairman asked, voice low but stern. "He once sacrificed his own bonus to cover staff salaries during a financial freeze. And his daughter, who you mocked, asked for nothing but the chance to be evaluated like anyone else. You wouldn't last a day in her shoes." James staggered back, the words striking deeper than expected. He opened his mouth, then shut it. Mr. Blake turned away. "You're on probation. Your next move will define your future here." The room felt colder as James walked out, the crumpled complaint still clenched in his sweating palm. Faith received the invitation to her official onboarding review with little reaction. She had anticipated it would come. After all, she had requested to be treated like any other candidate. But as she walked into the modest boardroom and saw Agnes seated at the head of the panel, something inside her steadied. Agnes offered a short nod before gesturing to the chair across from her. "We'll be fair," she said plainly, and Faith believed her. The panel asked rigorous questions about strategy, branding models, crisis communication. Faith answered each with quiet clarity, not trying to impress, but instead offering solutions grounded in experience and insight. Her hands remained folded on the table. She didn't quote buzzwords or use flamboyant language. Instead, she spoke with conviction and control, drawing diagrams when needed and referencing market shifts with precision. It was professional, not performative, and that's what stunned them most. After the session, Agnes asked the panel to step out, leaving her alone with Faith. She leaned forward, removing her glasses. "I knew your father," she said gently. "He once gave me a second chance when I was reckless with a campaign budget. He never told anyone, just quietly covered it and guided me through the recovery." Faith blinked, overwhelmed by the quiet confession. Agnes continued, "I watched you handle everything this week with a strength I couldn't have mustered at your age. You remind me of the kind of people this place was built for." Faith swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "But I don't want memories to open doors. Let my work do it." Agnes nodded, a small smile forming. "Then you'll go far." She stood, extended her hand, and Faith shook it. The review had ended, but the message was clear. She wasn't just the daughter of a man they respected. She was a force in her own right. The following Monday, James knocked softly on the glass partition by Faith's desk. He looked drained, his eyes lacking their usual shine, his posture more tentative than proud. Faith glanced up from her spreadsheet, expression unreadable. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. She stood slowly and followed him to the corner hallway, where conversations were less likely to echo. "I owe you an apology," James began, avoiding her gaze. Not just for how I treated you that first day, but for what I tried to do after. I filed something. It was dismissed, rightfully. His voice cracked slightly. You didn't deserve what I said, or how I made you feel. Faith leaned back against the wall, arms folded. You didn't know who I was, she said. But the truth is, it wouldn't have made a difference, because you didn't want to know. James winced. You're right. I saw the shoes, the dress, and I thought I knew the whole story. Faith nodded once. The story isn't in the shoes, James. It's in the steps a person takes. Her tone wasn't cruel, just firm. James looked away. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it. There was a pause, then Faith extended a hand. I won't hold it against you. Growth begins somewhere. He looked surprised but shook her hand quietly. As they walked back, Lily caught the exchange from a distance. Later, she approached Faith at the pantry. I saw what you did, she said. You gave him what he didn't deserve. Faith stirred her tea without looking up. Sometimes giving grace isn't about them. It's about not letting bitterness weigh you down. Lily smiled faintly. You're changing this place, Faith. One silence at a time. Faith didn't answer, but the warmth in her eyes said enough. It was during one particularly quiet afternoon, when the office buzz had thinned out and most staff were out on lunch breaks, that Faith found herself sitting alone in the break room, nursing a cup of tea and flipping through a slim poetry book she always carried. The scent of lemon and old pages filled the air. Agnes walked in a few minutes later, her eyes scanning the shelves before pausing at the sight of the book in Faith's hands. Is that Songs of the Distant Fire by Okoye Anaba? She asked with a raised brow. Faith looked up, a smile tugging at her lips. Yes, my father loved this one. He used to read it to me before bed, said it helped him think clearer during hard seasons. Agnes sank slowly into the chair opposite her, her voice gentler now. That book saved me once, back when I nearly quit this job. They sat in silence for a while, each flipping through pages, sharing titles, authors, and the unexpected solace found in lines etched by strangers. Agnes eventually spoke, her tone distant but raw. There was a time I believed I had to dress up my pain in order to be heard here. I bought silence with performance. Faith nodded, understanding deeply without asking for details. They teach you to mask before they teach you to speak, she said softly. Agnes chuckled, though there was no joy in it. You don't mask, she said. You just walk in like you are, and somehow it forces people to see themselves. Faith glanced down at her tea. I don't mean to confront anyone, she murmured. But I also won't shrink to make them comfortable. Agnes gave a slow, approving nod. Your father would be proud. You're not just wearing his name, you're defending the dignity he lived by. In that small, forgotten corner of the building, two women from different generations quietly realized they'd both been trying to survive the same storm with different tools. Saturday morning came with soft rain tapping against Faith's apartment window. She didn't bother with an umbrella as she walked the familiar red soil path to her father's gravesite. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that asked nothing of you, no answers, no composure. She knelt slowly, brushing leaves away from the engraved stone. Hey, Daddy, she whispered. I made it to Blake Holdings. Just like you dreamed, but not like I imagined. Her voice trembled. They tried to dismiss me because of my shoes. She chuckled dryly. You would have laughed so hard at that. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her old sandals, the same ones she had worn on interview day. Carefully, she laid them beside the gravestone. I'm leaving these here. I carried them through enough. A soft breeze answered, brushing her cheek like a father's hand. She sat on the grass, legs folded, speaking to the wind like she had so many nights growing up without him. You said the world would push back. You didn't say it would feel this lonely, she confessed. But you also said I'm more than what they see. And you were right. For a moment, silence wrapped her like a blanket. The city noise was far behind, and all that remained was memory and peace. I forgave James, she added, her voice quieter now. Not because he asked, but because you taught me not to carry weights I didn't put on. She reached into her notebook and pulled out a pressed flower, an ixora from her father's old garden, and placed it under the stone. Then she stood, her knees damp, her back straighter than when she arrived. Thank you for teaching me to stand, even when no one claps, she said. As she walked away, the old sandals remained behind, like a chapter closed with love instead of bitterness. That Monday, Mr. Blake summoned Agnes to his private office. On the mahogany desk lay a thick manila folder marked Confidential Legacy Archive. "I want you to look through this," he said. "Tell me what's missing." Agnes, intrigued, pulled it open and began flipping through the contents. It was a historical record of Blake Holdings' early years, strategies, partnerships, letters. But something stood out like an echo in an empty room. John Adams' name was missing from every founding memo. No credits, no signatures, not even acknowledgments in press statements. "He's invisible here," Agnes murmured, stunned. Mr. Blake sighed and leaned back in his chair. After he passed, there was pressure to simplify our origin story. New investors preferred a single figurehead. I didn't fight hard enough to keep him visible. I convinced myself faith would never come. Agnes looked up sharply. "So you let the world forget the man who saved your company, just to keep it marketable?" Mr. Blake's eyes burned with shame. "I failed him, and now his daughter is paying for it in silent judgment from people who should have known her name before she walked in." Agnes closed the file slowly. "Then let's change the story," she said, "while she's still here to witness it." That evening, Faith returned to her desk to find a handwritten envelope on top of her keyboard. Inside was a short note. "Come to the archive room at 6 p.m. Bring no expectations. Just yourself." TB intrigued, she arrived at the small glass-walled room just before sunset. Inside, Agnes was waiting beside a projector screen and stacks of old ledgers. "Tonight," Agnes said, "we begin restoring the pages they erased." For the first time, Faith felt not only seen, but invited into a reckoning she had unknowingly carried on her shoulders all her life. The invitation arrived 3 days later, a simple cream card with the Blake Holdings seal embossed in gold. The subject read, "Commemoration Ceremony Honoring Legacy." Faith stared at it for a moment, heart racing. No other explanation followed. That Friday, employees gathered in the central atrium, a high-ceiling space rarely used except for board meetings and major announcements. On the far wall, previously blank, now hung a long polished marble slab engraved with names in elegant brass. Pillars of Blake Holdings. Most names were familiar: executives, visionaries, early partners. But in the center, in slightly larger type, was a new addition: John Chinedu Adams, co-founder. Financial visionary, silent strength. A hush fell across the room. Faith stood near the back, nearly trembling. Mr. Blake stepped forward and spoke, voice slow and thick with emotion. "This wall honors not just those who led loudly, but those who shaped us quietly." Faith's breath caught when she heard her father's name echo through the chamber. She walked toward the wall slowly, the sea of faces parting silently as she passed. Lily blinked back tears. Even James lowered his gaze, visibly moved. When Faith reached the marble, she touched the engraving with trembling fingers. The weight of years lifted from her spine as though something long overdue had finally come full circle. "Thank you," she whispered, not to Mr. Blake, not to the company, but to her father, whose dignity had been restored without a fight. Agnes stood to the side, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction. "He would have hated the spotlight," she whispered to Mr. Blake. The chairman nodded. "But his daughter earned it." After the event, as employees quietly dispersed, a few approached Faith, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. They asked about her father, about his work, about her vision. She didn't bask in the attention. She simply smiled and answered, not as a legacy's daughter, but as her own becoming. Despite the public admiration, not everyone was pleased with Faith's rising presence. In the shadows of whispered praises and cautious compliments, envy festered. A senior associate named Clara, sharp-tongued and quick with sarcasm, began to drop remarks masked in politeness. "Must be nice," she said one morning in the elevator, glancing at Faith, "to inherit visibility without working your way up the hard way." Faith looked at her calmly. "You think I haven't?" Clara smiled thinly. "You've been here 5 minutes and already have your father's name on a wall." The bitterness was clear. Others began echoing similar sentiments, though rarely to Faith's face. Rumors crept into meetings, suggestions that she was being groomed for something more, that the chairman had plans, that she was untouchable. It didn't matter how diligently she worked or how quietly she moved. Jealousy had a way of drowning logic. The tension reached its peak when Clara, in front of the entire project team, implied Faith had unfairly influenced client retention data. Must be easier when the chairman trusts your numbers without second-guessing, she said with a smug grin. Faith remained composed, but her chest tightened. She responded slowly. If you want to verify the numbers, please feel free. I have every dataset backed up. Her tone was steady, without venom. Agnes, seated nearby, interjected with a cool glance at Clara. Or we could just trust the results, since they've exceeded projections for the third quarter in a row. That silence that followed was damning. But instead of feeling vindicated, Faith only felt heavier. She wasn't angry at Clara. She was exhausted by what her name had come to represent in other people's minds. After the meeting, she sat quietly in the stairwell, staring at her reflection in the glass. I didn't ask for elevation, she whispered to herself. I asked for a chance. And now, it felt like both were being used against her. That evening, Faith made a decision. She went to Mr. Blake's office and requested a transfer, nothing dramatic, just a shift in project assignment. I'd like to lead a dormant division, she said. Something quiet, off the radar. Let the gossip die on its own. Mr. Blake looked at her long and hard. You don't have to prove anything, he said. But Faith shook her head. Maybe not. But I want my growth to echo beyond my last name. Let my voice be heard, even if no one's listening yet. He finally nodded. You remind me of John Moore every day. And so, she was moved to a forgotten corner of the company, a small digital marketing branch that had been shelved 2 years ago after a budget freeze. It was dusty, outdated, and filled with broken systems. But to Faith, it was soil, and soil was all she ever needed. She worked alone at first, reviewing past campaigns, redrafting proposals, studying overlooked metrics. Most people didn't notice she was gone. Some assumed she'd been sidelined. Others, like Clara, called it a graceful demotion. Faith didn't correct them. She simply arrived early and left late. No press, no fanfare, just process. One afternoon, she received a quiet knock on her makeshift office door. It was Agnes. I figured you'd be here, she said. Brought you something. She handed over a stack of old reports. You'll need these if you plan to resurrect this department. Faith took them with a smile. You came all the way down here just for that? Agnes shrugged. Great things grow underground. I just thought I'd water something. Faith laughed softly, for the first time in weeks. It wasn't triumph, it was peace. The kind that only comes when you're building something no one sees yet. Weeks passed, and the silence surrounding Faith's absence turned into reluctant curiosity. The dormant division she had taken over, barely a whisper on the corporate map, was now quietly drawing attention. Faith had rebuilt the client pitch deck from scratch, redesigned the branding for outdated campaigns, and initiated an outreach program that started bringing in leads no one had expected. She didn't parade her success, but the numbers spoke. At the quarterly board meeting, one of the executives paused mid-presentation. There's been an unexpected spike in digital engagement, he said, frowning as he scrolled. Almost a 17% increase in dormant markets. Mr. Blake didn't speak at first. He already knew the source. That would be the Digital Renewal Initiative, Agnes said calmly. Led by Faith Adams. The board members murmured, surprised. I thought that division was still inactive, one of them said. Apparently, it's more alive than the ones we've been funding. That same day, Faith received a message. You've been added to the agenda. Prepare to present. She didn't panic. Instead, she calmly pulled out her reports and printed her slides, simple, clear, direct. When she walked into the boardroom in a navy blue dress that belonged to her late mother, heads turned, not because of her outfit, but because of her presence. She stood tall, steady, and delivered her data without fanfare. No name-dropping, no legacy claims. Just pure insight, clean execution, and measurable growth. What we've built isn't just revival, it's resonance, she said. The audience we ignored is the one talking about us now. Let's not silence them again. After her presentation, the room remained quiet for a beat before applause began, first from Agnes, then from others. Even Mr. Blake clapped, slowly and meaningfully. For the first time, Faith didn't feel like she was trying to be heard. She was the sound. The sun had already begun to dip when Agnes knocked on the frame of Faith's office door that evening, her silhouette framed by the last orange glow. Faith looked up, surprised. "Working late again?" Agnes asked, stepping inside with 2 paper cups of coffee. "Old habits," Faith smiled. They sat across from each other in the quiet. Agnes exhaled, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cup. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have said earlier." Faith sat forward, curious. "Years ago, I hit a financial wall. My mother was ill. I made a reckless choice with company funds to cover her hospital bills. It was your father who discovered it." She paused. "He should have reported me. Instead, he came to my desk one evening, handed me the invoice, and said, 'Mistakes don't define you, but how you recover from them might.'" Her voice trembled slightly. He covered the gap, quietly. "No judgment. No debt." Faith's eyes misted. "He never told me that." Agnes smiled faintly. "He didn't tell anyone. That's who he was." She sipped her coffee. "But when I saw you walk through those doors, I knew it was him all over again. The posture, the calm, the refusal to explain yourself just to earn space." Faith stared at the floor, overwhelmed. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Agnes leaned back. "Because I wanted to be sure you weren't just a mirror of him, but a voice of your own." She gestured around the room. "And now I am." The air between them grew warm, heavy with mutual understanding. Agnes set the coffee down and added, "I've seen this company rise and stumble, but watching you rebuild something with grace instead of vengeance, it gives me hope again." Faith whispered a quiet thank you, her heart swelling. This wasn't just about legacy. It was about character and the quiet ways it echoed forward. At the next leadership strategy session, Faith raised her hand just as the meeting was winding down. The room quieted, sensing she wasn't about to speak for attention. "Before we close," she began, "I'd like to propose a revision of our hiring and evaluation protocols." Brows lifted. She continued, "We've spent years building an image, but we haven't always reflected the values behind it. Our recruitment process still leans on aesthetic impressions. Our onboarding still favors polished surfaces over real substance. That has to change." A few shuffled papers. One executive asked, "What exactly are you suggesting?" Faith replied, "That we rebrand our recruitment culture from the inside, starting with blind evaluations, mandatory diversity training for gatekeeping roles, and a campaign that reintroduces our core identity, substance over style." Her words struck like lightning, measured but undeniable. Mr. Blake folded his arms, a slow smile forming. "Seconded," he said before anyone else could react. "I think it's long overdue." Murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Even those who had doubted her before now leaned forward with interest. Faith didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded. After the meeting, Lily caught her in the corridor. "You just shook the ground, you know that?" she said, half grinning. "I wasn't trying to," Faith replied. "I just wanted to keep someone else from feeling how I did on my first day." That afternoon, the company's internal newsletter carried an announcement. "A new era at Blake Holdings begins, rooted in integrity, grown by courage." Attached to the article was an image of the new policy document bearing the title Substance Over Style, authored by Faith Adams. For the first time, her name wasn't whispered or questioned. It was a movement. James sat alone in the empty conference room, hands buried in his hair, the flickering fluorescent light above him casting uneven shadows on the table. The facade he had carefully upheld, the sharp suits, the performative confidence, had been steadily crumbling. Ever since Faith's rise, something in him had begun to fracture. He wasn't just losing visibility, he was losing himself. That afternoon, he had watched her present a company-wide reform with poise and clarity. She wasn't boastful, but her presence filled the room. And he had felt small, invisible in a way he never imagined. He thought about the day he first saw her, the disdain he'd shown, the careless dismissal. And now? Her name was etched into every meaningful transformation within the company. The ache in his chest wasn't jealousy anymore. It was regret. Mr. Blake entered the room without knocking, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. James didn't look up. "You were right," he said, voice hoarse. "About everything." The chairman walked around the table slowly. "What changed?" James laughed bitterly. watching someone carry so much weight with grace while I was busy building walls of arrogance. It undid me. Mr. Blake sighed and sat across from him. I once told you that leadership is more than titles. It's about being remembered for the way you lifted others, not how loudly you climbed. James nodded. I didn't lift anyone. I tripped the first person I saw and called it gatekeeping. There was a long silence before Mr. Blake said quietly, You still have time to rebuild. But you'll have to get used to the back row for a while. James looked up, eyes red. I'll take the back row, as long as I can still be in the room. The chairman offered a faint smile. Then start there, and this time listen. Faith's days became quieter, not because her role had shrunk, but because the noise around her no longer held power. She'd learned to separate distraction from direction. Her office remained in the quiet wing where the marketing revival had begun, though she now had the freedom to relocate. She didn't. It reminded her of her roots, of the simplicity that kept her grounded. One morning, a knock came on her door, and a young woman entered nervously. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her blouse was wrinkled, shoes obviously worn from years of use, but her eyes were hopeful. Are you Miss Faith Adams? She asked. Faith stood, offering a warm smile. Just Faith. Come in. The girl clutched her small folder. I just started my internship. Someone told me you were the one who'd understand. Faith gestured to the seat across from her. I think we'll get along just fine. As the girl spoke, Faith listened, really listened. She reminded her of herself in so many ways. Quiet, overlooked, but burning with unseen potential. I'm not from the best school, the intern admitted. And sometimes I feel like I'm just taking up space. Faith leaned forward, her voice calm. I wore sandals to my interview here. The girl blinked, confused. But you're... I was invisible too, Faith said softly. But you don't need to be loud to be valuable. You just need to be present, prepared, and patient. She handed the girl a notepad. Write everything you learn. Don't waste your questions, and never apologize for your beginnings. The intern nodded, visibly emotional. After she left, Faith sat back and closed her eyes. She felt no need to prove anything anymore. Her peace wasn't in titles or recognition. It was in seeing someone else step forward without fear. For the first time since arriving at Blake Holdings, she didn't feel like she was healing from something. She felt like she was building something within herself and beyond. It arrived in a sealed envelope, placed neatly on Faith's desk before she arrived. Handwritten in the familiar looping strokes of Mr. Blake, the letter carried no official letterhead, just his initials at the bottom. She opened it slowly, unfolding the thick parchment with a growing sense of curiosity. The letter began plainly. Faith, I'm not writing as your chairman. I'm writing as a man who once made a promise to your father and almost failed to keep it. Her eyes stung before she could read the next line. Your presence in this company has reminded me why we started it. It was never about elegance. It was about essence, about truth. And somehow, in walking through our doors, you showed us that we forgot. The words weren't flowery, but they held weight. Real weight. The kind that comes when one human speaks directly to another's soul. The letter continued, Your father once told me that greatness doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes undeniable. You are undeniable, Faith. Not because of him, but because of you. She folded the letter carefully, cradling it like a fragile thing. She didn't cry, not this time. Instead, she stood up and walked to the company archives. She placed the letter beside her father's restored file, between the ledgers and founding records. This wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about closure. When she returned to her office, she sat at her desk with renewed clarity. She opened her laptop and typed a single line at the top of a fresh document. To the ones who came in quiet, this is your story too. She knew now that her journey wasn't just for her healing. It was a bridge, stretching backward and forward, for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough based on what they wore or where they came from. The bridge had a name, and it was hers. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Faith walked into the building holding an old, carefully laminated brown envelope, the very same one she had clutched on her first day, the day James had mocked her and dismissed her potential. The contents had long since been digitized, but she had preserved the envelope out of respect for what it symbolized. Courage without validation. As she stepped into the front lobby, she noticed a new intern at the reception desk, nervously adjusting her headset and dropping her pen twice in under a minute. Faith smiled warmly and approached. "Good morning," she said. The girl looked up startled, then stood. "Miss Adams. Oh, I mean Faith. I've heard so much about you." Faith gently slid the envelope across the desk. "I'd like this to stay here, somewhere close to the entrance, in a frame if possible." The girl looked at it, puzzled. "What's inside?" Faith smiled. "Nothing now." But once it carried the hopes of a girl no one wanted to notice. She paused, then added, "It should be a reminder, not of who I became, but of how I started." A few feet away, Agnes had been listening quietly. She stepped forward and placed her hand on Faith's shoulder. "We'll make sure it stays visible." Faith nodded. "Not for me, for the next one who walks in scared, underdressed, and underestimated." As she walked away from the front desk, several staff members who once overlooked her now greeted her with genuine warmth. But Faith wasn't seeking recognition. She simply wanted to create space where others wouldn't have to fight to be seen. Later that day, Lily sent an internal company-wide email with an image of the envelope mounted in a clear frame at the front reception. Beneath it read a small gold plaque. She walked in with nothing but her name and left the door open for those behind her. That night, Faith returned home and sat by her window, the city glowing beneath a velvet sky. It had been a long journey, one marked by silence, resilience, and quiet transformation. She placed her father's old photograph beside her on the windowsill and whispered, "We did it. You and I." As sleep eventually found her, it carried her into a dream so vivid it felt more like memory than imagination. She was standing inside the atrium of Blake Holdings again. But this time, it was different. The walls were covered with portraits, not of chairmen or award recipients, but of janitors, clerks, interns, and assistants. People who had shaped the company without fanfare. And in the center of it all was a marble sculpture of her father, smiling, not solemn, holding a notepad in one hand and an open door in the other. He turned and looked at her, eyes full of pride, then nodded. "You understood what even I forgot," he said. "That dignity isn't inherited, it's chosen. Every single day." Faith walked toward him, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Did I honor your story?" He placed a hand over his heart. "You didn't just honor it, you finished it." She awoke with warmth in her chest and tears on her cheeks. The morning light poured in softly. She sat up, a quiet smile forming as she whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." At Blake Holdings, the framed envelope at the front desk remained untouched, except by the occasional wide-eyed intern who paused to read the plaque and whisper the name Faith Adams, like a quiet blessing. Her story wasn't told in loud applause or spotlighted speeches. It was told in the open door, the empty chair, and the choice to walk in anyway. Here's the Bible verse, 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Moral of the story: never let the world's shallow judgments convince you that you are unworthy. Sometimes your quiet strength is the very thing that changes everything. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much.